Welcome to the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast, brought to you by Toyota. Toyota has more all-wheel drive and four-wheel drive vehicles than any other brand. Find yours and shine on. Toyota, let's go places. With Charlie Roumeliotis, I am Pat Boyle. We are joined by NHL prospects expert from The Athletic, Scott Wheeler. Scott, thanks again for joining us on the Breakaway Podcast. Florida Stanley Cup champs for the second straight year. So now the floor is yours with just over a week away from the draft.
This is it. This is crunch time. It's always good news. Selfishly, it's always good news when the Stanley Cup ends earlier, because it means more time for the sick readers at The Athletic to fully turn their page to wanting everything draft related, and we're going to fuel that addiction in the next 10 or so days here.
I love that. Yes. Thank you for carving out some time for us, because it feels like this next couple weeks are when you're pulled in a lot of different directions. So thank you for jumping on. Before we start, though, I have to ask, Scott. So you and Corey Pronman are two of the best when it comes to draft coverage, and you guys both work for the same outlet, The Athletic. How much do you guys compare notes together, or do you like to keep it separate to kind of form different perspectives?
Oh, well, we definitely keep it separate. If you follow either of our work over the years, over the last decade plus, you'll know that our lists are often very divergent. I think that makes for good reading at The Athletic, and we don't cater to trying to be different from each other. Our lists this year are actually for this year's class, and we've talked about this a lot on our podcast and even in our writing and some of the debate pieces that we do, where we've struggled to debate this year, because this year, our lists have been more similar, more sort of in lockstep and aligned than they've ever been. But there have been years where even the top of our lists look almost nothing alike. So that's been a benefit. Certainly, we talk about these. I mean, we have our own show, the Athletic Hockey Show, that we talk about these kids together every Friday. And that's out there in the world, but we're also in the rink together a lot over the course of the season. We're having dinner together. We're in the same hotels together. All of the major events, we're typically both there: U18 Worlds, World Juniors, Frozen Four, Memorial Cup, World Junior Summer Showcase, CHL USA Prospects Challenge, all of those events. Corey and I are sort of a two-man team, but we work off of each other well, A, because we view the game and players much differently in many ways from each other, and B, because I can kind of lean into the reporting side of it and the storytelling side of it, and Corey is more focused on the analysis and the rankings and that side of it. So it makes for a good mix. I'm a journalist by trade. Corey is a lawyer in a previous life. So we even approach our job in different ways. So that part of it creates an interesting dynamic, I think.
Blackhawks picked third this year. They picked second last year, of course, first the year before when they took Bedard. The draft, I think, once again starts with their selection. Let's start at the top. And the consensus seemingly number one and number two pick, Matthew Schaefer, the defenseman, and Michael Misa. How confident are you that will be the way it goes, 1 and 2, Schaefer and Misa?
I think Schaefer at 1 is pretty well a foregone conclusion. I haven't talked to a single scout in the last month, dating back to prior to the combine, basically from the Memorial Cup ending, when hockey is officially over for this season, through till today as we speak, the 8 days, whatever it is, 7-8 days from the draft. I haven't talked to a single person. There was a time when Porter Martone was in the conversation and James Hagens was in the conversation in the fall. Certainly coming into the year, James Hagens was in the conversation. Certainly in the fall, I spoke to people who had Porter Martone at number 1. We're really talking like September, October, when he got off to his 2-point per game start. With the Brampton Steelheads, though, he faded a little bit through November and December after just being okay at the CHL USA Prospects Challenge. And then certainly at the World Juniors, people started to ask questions about him as sort of a first or second overall pick versus a more likely a sort of 5, 6, 7 kind of talent. But today it's Matthew Schaefer for everybody. And I think the combine solidified that. If you've ever spoken to the kid or been in the same room as the kid, he is a very, very, very impressive young man. Carries himself like he's going to be the sort of future face of a franchise. I think he could be a captain in the NHL. And that on top of his quality as a defenseman, the way he skates, one of the very best skating defensemen in 12 years of doing this now that I've covered. And then despite the injuries, was just clearly the best player at several signature events this year that he did participate in. So I think it's Schaefer at 2. I still think it's Misa. I still lean Misa based off everything I've heard, based off who Michael Misa is as a player and kid as well. But I do think there's at least a debate happening within the San Jose Sharks as to who they're going to take there. I've heard that they like Anton Frondell. I've heard that they like 𝗵𝗶𝘹 𝗟𝗏. I still think it's going to be Misa and would be a little surprised if it's not Misa at 2. But I do think the draft is at least live a little bit there. There are people in the league who don't believe that Michael Misa is the second best player in this class. And there are camps for different people in that range. But I think it's if it's not Misa, it will be Desnoyers or Frondell as far as the intel that I've had on who the Sharks like. But still think it's probably Misa there.
So in your most recent mock draft, I think it was like a week and a half or so ago, you have the Blackhawks taking Anton Frondell at number 3. And you've been pretty consistent in feeling like he is a guy that the Blackhawks are targeting. This is assuming that Michael Misa goes number 2 to San Jose. What would the Blackhawks be getting in Anton Frondell if they do take him at number 3?
In Anton Frondell, you're getting a heavy set 6'1" and a quarter, 6'1.5" center who could be a real pillar of as a top 6 center moving forward. Now, there are people who believe that Anton Frondell could be a winger at the next level. I know Kyle Davidson said at the Combine in his conversations with reporters that he believes that Connor Bedard and Frank Nazar are the team's 1-2 centers at this point in time. I'm not sold that those are your 1-2 centers as a Stanley Cup contending team. I think there's a good chance Anton Frondell could be a winger in the NHL, but I think if you're taking Anton Frondell, it's likely with an eye to moving one of Connor Bedard or Frank Nazar to the wing and slotting Anton as a center. Ironically, despite his center listing, Anton played almost exclusively the wing with Djurgården in 𝗵𝗇 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗀, the second tier in Sweden last year. He has played a good bit of center for the Swedish national team to mixed results, some really high highs with the Swedish national team at a couple of Five Nations tournaments, but also an underwhelming performance coming out of the Djurgården promotion to the SHL run that he was a part of at this year's U18 Worlds. So there has been a bit of a mixed bag with Frondell in terms of his play. He's also dealt with some injury troubles, 2 separate injuries over the course of the last 2 seasons that impacted him. But Frondell is viewed, he talks about himself as Alexander Barkov, and I've heard people talk about even 𝗻𝗏cie 𝗁𝗁𝗏 with him. I don't view Anton Frondell in that range, but I look at a player like a Brayden Schenn or like a better version of an Anton Lundell, who's now won 2 Stanley Cups as a top 9 center for the Florida Panthers. I think Lundell and Schenn, maybe with a little bit more offense, he's got a bigger shot than Brayden Schenn and Anton Lundell have. He's going to crank his one-timer on the power play, potentially opposite flanks to Connor Bedard on the power play. I think all of those things start to come into focus with Frondell. But I think you're looking at maybe not a point per game center. I think that's lofty expectations for him, even as a potential 3rd overall pick. And even as a kid who outproduced William Nylander and David Pastrnak at the same age in 𝗵𝗇 𝗨𝗏𝗏𝗀 this year. But I think you're looking at a 60-point, 30-goal center who can impact play both ways and is reliable defensively and provides some strength over pucks and some size that the Blackhawks lack within their prospect pool.
You know, Scott, I know there's a lot of folks out there that looked at the production at the World's U18s in Texas and were underwhelmed by it. But when you factor in that he won with his Swedish team playing in, I would say, more of a checking role, and then, you know, they win the championship, they're promoted, he leaves the party, so to speak, comes to Texas, and then he's
jet lag.
Yeah, then he's asked to be more of a scorer. I could kind of see how that would be a lot on a smaller surface. I could see how that's a lot to throw at a young man in a short period of time.
Yeah, and they offered to have him sit the first game after he arrived because of the long travel. I believe he said at the time that it was 14 or 16 hours of travel to get there, and then he basically played right away on no sleep. Who knows whether he was hungover? We won't go down that path, but I'm sure he had been enjoying himself after their promotion. It's a big deal to earn promotion into the SHL for a club like Djurgården. And yeah, he wasn't at his best. But the challenge there is that you don't want to give the kid too much leeway. I still think it is a part of the evaluation of Anton Frondell that he has had 2 or 3 or 4 different moments over the course of the last 2 years where he's blended in, where he hasn't dominated. We've seen Porter Martone at U18 Worlds, and he was one of the best players in the tournament. Brady Martin made a greater impact for Team Canada at this year's tournament. James Hagens, who's in that range, is the U18 World's record holder. So the great players at this tournament, especially with no Russian participation over the last few years, have really lit it up at the tournament. I do think it is at least relevant that Frondell didn't do that. But for all of the reasons that you highlighted, you also have to give him a little bit of grace in his performance at the tournament. And frankly, I think we put too much emphasis and too much stock into this event by and large. And it can do more harm when a kid really pops off, if you will, and has a great showing. I think we've gotten carried away with that over the years. 𝗻𝗁cie 𝗵𝗶𝗹 was taken too high by the Vancouver Canucks because of his international showings in his draft year, both at the 𝗻𝗁cie and at U18s. I would argue that Philip Broberg was taken too high at 8th overall by the Edmonton Oilers because of his showing internationally. Jonathan 𝗻𝗁 maybe potentially for the Vancouver Canucks as well. Some players who've really shined at that tournament. So it isn't the be all and end all that he wasn't a stud there. They also had a very deep team, 3 legit scoring lines on this Swedish national team. So he wasn't relied upon to be the guy in ways that a James Hagens was or a Porter Martone was when they played at U18 Worlds.
So Caleb Desnoyers also seems to be in the conversation for Chicago at number 3 overall. Him and Frondell seem to be the 2 200-foot complete centers that you can slide in if you're Chicago, maybe on that second line position. Between Frondell and Desnoyers, which one do you like better, and how close is the gap between them?
Well, I have them 5 and 6 on my list, so they're back to back for me. I have Desnoyers at 5 and Frondell at 6. I am partial to Caleb Desnoyers. I think he has just shown me more consistency in his game. Everything you hear about Caleb is that he's going to be a captain in the NHL as well. He's an awesome kid. Now, they both really worked the room at the Combine. They were 2 of the players who I heard the most positive reviews from in terms of interviews and the way that they carry themselves. They both have awesome personalities. I've spoken at length with each over the course of the last couple of years. Really great kids that way. They're both 6'1". They're both centers. Frondell has 20 plus pounds on Caleb. Caleb's a leaner 6'1" and has room to develop and sort of add weight in the gym. That will be impacted this summer. Caleb has told me at the Combine, as I reported out of that he dealt with 2 very serious wrist injuries dating back to November of his draft year at the CHL USA Prospects Challenge. He also had a shoulder injury this year. So I do wonder just about this important summer in Caleb's development and whether he's going to have the time that he needs, especially if he has a procedure on one of his wrists, whether he's going to have the time he needs to get stronger and to add the weight that he does need to add in the gym. But Caleb's an awesome player. He's a smarter hockey player in terms of the offensive side of the game and the way that he reads the game than Anton Frondell is. He doesn't have the big shot that Anton does in terms of the one-timer and the way that Anton can really lean into it. But I think Caleb's a smarter, more well-rounded player. He's better in the face-off circle. There are little elements to Caleb where you think, okay, this kid has the full package. This kid looks like, and he's used Jonathan Toews as his comp to me. I think that's obviously lofty. Jonathan Toews is going to be a Hall of Famer when he's finally retired here. But that's the kind of player you're talking about with Caleb Desnoyers. I think you're talking about a true winning center, the kind of player that you can win a Stanley Cup with. And for that and the consistency that I saw that in his game, that gives him the slight edge for me over Frondell.
Interesting. It sounds like, because we look at it also from an organizational standpoint, and the Hawks are pretty small in their top 6. So
yes,
for Frondell
and small within their pool, whether it's Nick Lardis, who scored 70 goals in the OHL this year, Roman Kantsarov, you go down the list of what's coming on top of the kids that you guys have already seen play, and Oliver Moore and Frank Nazar and those types. 𝗍𝗁 𝗵𝗹 maybe being a bit of the exception to that from a size standpoint. There's a lot of those 5'10" types within the organization.
So from that standpoint, Frondell obviously gets the age, and he's a thicker bigger body.
Yes.
But you said, he lacks the consistency. Who has more bite to their game? Take almost size out of the equation. Is there one that stands out when it comes to how they would handle things and in the corners and along the wall?
I think Caleb is a little because he lacks that strength. Maybe is a little sort of lighter along the wall in terms of the heaviness that Frondell can play with along the wall in battles. But I frankly wouldn't qualify either of them as super physical or mean or sort of. I would say that Caleb is ultra competitive. Caleb is the more competitive of the two players. But Frondell is the heavier, and you wonder about whether Caleb's competitiveness will have the same impact as Frondell's at the NHL level in terms of the Stanley Cup playoffs and that kind of a thing. Now, I think Caleb's going to get to 190, 195 pounds as his playing weight, whereas Frondell's probably going to play at 210, 215 as his playing weight. So there will be a bit of a gap there, but Desnoyers is going to get to a very respectable playing weight, and I don't see that as an issue. But they aren't the bowl you over in the corner, change a shift in terms of momentum with a big check type of players. They're really the only player in the top 7, 8, 9, 10 range that really checks that box with emphasis in this age group is Brady Martin.
So Porter Martone and James Hagens, you can even throw in Roger McQueen or Brady Martin. Maybe they might be in the conversation at number 3 as well. You're on record saying you believe it might come down to Frondell and Desnoyers, and I think on this podcast we've been saying the same thing for the last month or so. But if you're telling a Blackhawks fan why not Porter Martone or why not James Hagens, like what are the drawbacks on going that route versus kind of the reliable two-way center?
The case against Hagens is the case that we've talked about in terms of what they already have. It as great as James Hagens is as a player, and I'm a big believer in James Hagens. He's third on my list. I have him ahead of both Caleb Desnoyers and Anton Frondell. I think James Hagens has a chance to win the 𝗭𝗶𝘶 and have a huge year in college hockey next year. Love him. Love the player and the talent. But you do start to wonder, you watch the Stanley Cup playoffs, there are Sam Bennett's and Brad Marchand's and Evan Rodriguez types that can have success in the playoffs at that sort of 5'10" to 6 foot range. But if you have a ton of those guys and they don't maybe have that bite or that snarl that a Sam Bennett has or that a Brad Marchand has, it becomes tricky to sort of build a top 9 that can win a Stanley Cup, that can contend with the big boys in the playoffs. And as a result, I just think that makes James Hagens' sell to the Blackhawks a harder sell than it maybe makes James Hagens' sell to some other organizations because of all of the names that we've talked about, because of Oliver Moore, because of Frank Nazar, because of Connor Bedard. You just start to look at what the shape of that top 9 could look like if let's say one of 𝗵𝗻𝗏 or Roman 𝗵𝗫𝗀 makes it. Suddenly you've just got a complexion that is too small. Even if you have 𝗙𝗏𝗏𝗹 or Colton Dach or free agents who have size, you name it, it still would skew a little small with James Hagens and Bedard as your 2 focal points. So that's the case against James Hagens. I think it has less to do with the player and more to do with what's already established within the Blackhawks pool. The case against Martone is that he doesn't have the speed that they've placed a premium emphasis on as an organization within the Blackhawks. You go through the list of the players that they've taken over the last 3 or 4 drafts, and to a man, they can all, the forwards in particular, can all really move. We haven't even mentioned Ryan Green. Ryan Green is a high-end skater. Samuel Savoy, who they took. These are kids who aren't even necessarily going to play in the NHL or be NHL options, but it's been a priority. Nick Lardis, Roman 𝗵𝗫𝗀, Oliver Moore. Oliver Moore is one of the best skaters that's come through the draft in years, frankly. And Frank Nazar was right at the top of his draft class as well in terms of the skating piece of the puzzle. Ironically, Bedard may be the anomaly that way, where skating is an area of Bedard's game that needs to take a step here. But Martone just doesn't really have that. Martone, I think, plays with adequate pace to the point where you still believe Porter Martone is going to be a premium potential top of the lineup winger in the NHL. But there have been questions from scouts over the course of this season, questions even within the OHL amongst OHL coaches that I've spoken to about him, about just whether he keeps his feet moving enough, whether he keeps his feet moving fast enough. And it just doesn't really fit the archetype that the Blackhawks have targeted for that reason.
Between Porter Martone and Roger McQueen, the 6'5" center who missed most of the year with the back injury, who do you like between those two? Because the Hawks could. We've heard that number 3 could be in play. They could trade down a little bit and maybe would find more of an appetite to go after Martone or McQueen. Compare and contrast those two players.
Yeah, Martone is a big, sort of more of a net-driven winger. There are actually scouts who've wanted to see Martone sort of take charge and be more physical. He has dropped the gloves repeatedly in the OHL, and he did lay some big hits this year, but it's just the consistency of that, the consistency of his competitiveness that teams have wanted to see a little bit more of, but still is more of a net-driven winger. When you talk about and profile Roger McQueen, he's more of a finesse player in terms of poise on the puck, slowing it down, picking teams apart with his playmaking. Both have great hands, among the better sets of hands in the draft class. Martone, despite considering himself a power forward and wanting to model his game after players like the Tkachuk brothers and 𝗵cie 𝗶𝗹, he's got a ton of sort of skill on the puck. I saw him in Brampton a lot this year over the last 3 years, frankly, in Brampton and Mississauga prior because of his late birthday. He's in '06. He's been in the OHL for 3 seasons to date, and they're one of the teams that's closest to me. The toe drags, the little skill plays. He's also a great passer. With McQueen, there's just more uncertainty, not just because of the back injury, but because he has a smaller sample size of production. Both are late '06s. Both are big kids. You run into them around the rink. Martone's the thicker of the two. Part of that is because of the impact I would imagine the back injury has had on McQueen's ability to train in the gym. I would say McQueen is a slightly better skater, but not by a sort of pronounced degree. And then McQueen's a center, obviously. I'm taking Porter Martone all day because of the sample size, because of the injury history with McQueen. But McQueen is a center, and 6'5" centers are almost an impossible piece to acquire. You look around the league at players who've played at that size and played at the top of the lineup in the NHL over the last decade, and it's a short list. It's Kevin Hayes, it's Blake Wheeler, it's Mikko Rantanen. There aren't a lot of players with the potential of Roger McQueen that are sort of top of the lineup forwards in that 6'5" mold. He compares himself to Ryan Getzlaf. Ironically, Porter Martone compares himself to Getzlaf's former teammate in 𝗵𝗵𝗹. But I think those are appropriate. I'm not sure whether McQueen has the competitiveness to be the sort of competitive heart of a team in the way that Ryan Getzlaf was throughout his career. But competitiveness is not an issue for Roger McQueen either. So I'll be interested to see where those guys go. I've kind of comped McQueen uniquely. I think he kind of comps closer to a Blake Wheeler maybe than he does to a Ryan Getzlaf. But Martone, I think you're looking at almost a little bit of a Mark Scheifele, not to bring it back to the Winnipeg Jets organization, but it's kind of a bit of a Scheifele versus a Wheeler thing, if you will.
You mentioned James Hagens and why he might not be Chicago's flavor, given the pool that they already have with those undersized forwards and just kind of similar makeup. But it doesn't even seem like he's kind of a slam dunk to even get inside the top 5 this year, when it feels like he was maybe the front runner going into the season to be the number 1 overall pick. Can you explain or shed some light on why that is? Is it just because Schaefer, Misa had incredible years and Hagens didn't have that Hobey Baker year that he had, or are there other factors that play into it?
Part of it is the season that Schaefer, despite how shortened it was, part of it is the season that Schaefer had. Despite the 17 games that he played in the OHL, he also played closer to 30 games in totality when you consider the 𝗻𝗄 Cup, his 4 periods that he played at the World Juniors, his World Junior pre-tournament games that he played, his World Junior selection camp games that he played, and the CHL USA Prospects Challenge, which was invented this year, and he was the best player on the same ice surface as Michael Misa, and it wasn't frankly close. And I thought Misa was great in that event, but Schaefer was a clear cut above everybody on the Canadian and the American side of that event. He was a clear cut above at the 𝗻𝗁𝗃 Cup. He was a clear cut above even drafted top prospects on Canada's blue line heading into the World Juniors in terms of Sam Dickinson, Tanner Molendyk, really premium D prospects in the sport right now. So that separated Schaefer on top of the kid that he is that I talked about off the top. And then Misa, 60 goals, 134 points. I think that helped to distinguish Misa after he was an exceptional status player and into the OHL, helped to sort of really reestablish himself in terms of that cachet that he had coming out of minor hockey after having broke at the OHL Cup Connor McDavid's OHL Cup scoring record. So that's part of it. And then part of it is that the 5'10", 5'10.5" players do tend to fall every year at the draft relative to where they're ranked. And part of it is that we just are coming out of seeing Adam Fantilli and Macklin Celebrini have historic 60, 70 point freshman years in college hockey, almost unheard of production. You have to go back to Paul Kariya and the like to find similar production. They've lit it up in ways that we haven't seen draft eligibles light it up. And then you contrast 60 or 70 points against 38 points in 38 games, which is still a very respectable season. A similar season to the one Matty Beniers had, who went second overall to the Seattle Kraken. A similar season to the one Kent Johnson had, who went fifth overall to the Columbus Blue Jackets, obviously. So the comp still really well with other top 5 picks on top of the U18 World's points record. And you go down the list of the accolades that James Hagens has stacked up over the last 3 years, but just didn't light it up with Boston. Kind of blended in on that team. Wasn't a great fit stylistically with his common line mate, Ryan Leonard, who is obviously now signed with the Washington Capitals. They never seemed to really mesh as a line after Will Smith fit so nicely between 𝗵𝗵𝗻𝗄 and Ryan Leonard. It just wasn't the same fit with Hagens. They broke him up at times and played him with other players on the second line at times. Didn't really mesh as a power play unit like they thought they would, I think, at BC last year. And there were a couple of games in particular late in the year against heavier college opponents where he struggled to have the same impact that he did against younger teams. There was a series coming out of the World Juniors where Hagens was excellent, 9 points in 7 games, first line center on the gold medal winning Team USA, led their forwards ahead of 𝗵𝗵𝗻𝗄 and Ryan Leonard in time on ice, playing more than 20 minutes a night as a draft eligible at the World Juniors in Ottawa. But there was a series in particular coming out of that against Merrimack College, a big, heavy team where he was pointless in 2 games against Merrimack and just really struggled to have an impact. And I think that plus just okay production relative to expectations, moments like that where he struggled against closer to what you're going to see in the NHL in terms of older teams, that just sort of gave people pause, and not pause on James Hagens as a top prospect. James Hagens is going to go in the top 6, 7, 8 picks in this draft. If he does fall, he's not going to fall much further than 6, 7, I wouldn't think. But in saying that, he just didn't grab it. He didn't take charge like some recent college players. And maybe that's just unfair to him after how good Fantilli and Celebrini were, but it is a part of the conversation for NHL teams.
All right, Scott, last one for you. Your thoughts just on the decentralized draft that we're going to have this year. Could it produce more trades because war rooms are able to have free discussion and not have somebody hanging over their shoulder? And do you think this is a one-off that will go back to the traditional NHL draft format, say, next year?
Yes, I think that decision has, to answer the last part of that question first, I think that decision has already been made. I know that Gary Bettman and Bill Daly would not come out publicly prior to hosting their decentralized draft and already admit that they've decided to go back to it. But I believe that the full expectation is that they will either just unilaterally make the decision to go back to it, or they will put it back to the GMs for a second vote like they did the first time around, and the GMs will decide to vote differently. Moving forward, I would expect that the problem that the GMs had will be mitigated. The big problem they had was coming out of the Nashville draft, as you guys will remember. Coming out of Nashville, there was a lot of travel headaches. There was a major storm over Nashville the night after the draft and the following morning that impacted flights. General managers were frustrated, stuck in the airport about getting home for their free agent work. They were doing their free agent work from planes and from airports. So that part of it, I think, really frustrated them. I think they'll mitigate against that by having it in better travel cities. I think you'll see it in places that have major airports like Montreal, like Dallas. I think those are the markets that they're talking about for the draft moving forward, potentially Vegas. Again, giving teams more flexibility in terms of getting in and out of town. And then on the flip side of that, I think you'll also see teams moving forward begin to stick around in the host city and just operate their free agency out of the host city and spend an extra 4 or 5 days there as well. In terms of my thoughts on the decentralized draft, I hate it. I think it's going to play poorly on TV. One of the things that I think the NHL has done well in terms of distinguishing itself from other leagues over the years, and I think the NHL does a lot of things poorly in terms of marketing the game, but I actually think the draft has been a major advantage that the NHL has had over the other leagues. It's one of one the way that they've done it traditionally. You see very private people, whether it's Kyle Dubas, whether it's Lou Lamoriello when he was a general manager in the league, Steve Yzerman, people who really like to be outside and operating outside of the limelight. You got to see how the sausage was made. I thought it looked great on TV, the ability to watch guys walk from table to table. Now, to your point about the trades, I know teams didn't like it for that reason, that it was hard to operate in secrecy. It was hard to make things happen when there's a table within earshot or the opposing general manager might be sitting off of your shoulder. That is going to benefit. There will be a bit of a benefit in terms of movement, I think. One of the challenges that the NHL draft has always had over the years is a lack of trades, a lack of transactions, a lot of buildup, and then often disappointing results in terms of deals. We were actually, last year was a bit of an exception to that with 𝗻𝗄𝗃𝗍 and some other moves that happened on the draft floor. But this year, NHL general managers and executives do believe that they will have a little bit more flexibility to pick up the phone and make transactions happen that way. So we'll see how it plays out. I don't think it's going to be great. There's also the very human, real world implications of what's happening in Los Angeles right now, and not just what's happening in Los Angeles, but what's happening very near to the Peacock Theater. And curfews have been in place in recent weeks. So we're still a week out, and a lot can change between now and then. But you could have the NHL putting on this major event in a city that is in a bit of turmoil, putting it lightly, but a bit of turmoil right now. So a lot at play in this decentralized format. The last time they did it, not to sort of drag on here, but the last time they did it, it also took too long. They did this during the pandemic, obviously. And if you guys remember day two of the pandemic draft, it was a disaster in terms of just how long it took to coordinate the picks. I think they will have learned a lot of lessons from that. But it does drag on when there's all these lines of communications and the team can't just walk up on stage and make their selection. So hopefully everybody's got their phones plugged in, and it's central registry is all over it, and we move quickly here.
Scott Wheeler, you're a wealth of knowledge. You and Corey do a tremendous job with The Athletic all year long. This isn't just a few weeks that you guys dive into it. It is must read, and we will check out all your work on The Athletic. Thank you.
Thanks so much, guys.
All right, Charlie, we just heard from Scott Wheeler. Great stuff as always. We really appreciate him taking the time out here before the draft. Biggest takeaway from our conversation?
Yeah, well, first off, man, we've had both Scott and Corey on our podcast in the last month or so, and they are just an amazing resource for NHL fans. So I want to thank Scott and Corey for both coming on, knowing how important the discussion is for Chicago every year because they've been picking at the top of the draft. So thank you to them both. I thought it was interesting. So Scott has been kind of in lockstep with me about since day one, since the NHL draft lottery. Scott has been saying he feels like the decision is going to come down to Anton Frondell or Caleb Desnoyers for Chicago at number 3. And so that's why I asked him specifically about what are the differences, like how close is the gap? Because Corey Pronman, I believe, he has Caleb Desnoyers as his 4th best prospect, and Scott has Frondell ahead of, or did he say yet? I think he has Frondell 5 and Desnoyers 6. So he has them both close. But I thought it was interesting when he was talking about Frondell that he has played primarily on the wing this season. But I think if you're Chicago, if they do take Anton Frondell, they're doing so under the impression that he's going to slide into a top 6 center position. Like, I don't think you would take a player that high just to bump him over to the wing. I think it gives you options. I know Kyle Davidson said he sees Connor Bedard and Frank Nazar as the kind of the 1-2 centers. But I think if you are drafting Anton Frondell or Caleb Desnoyers for that matter, I do think it's with the intention that one of those two are going to slot in at the second line center position.
Yeah, and to your point, Scott Powers wrote a good piece on Frondell and his relationship with Marcus Kruger, who was on the same team. And so I think he was more of a winger because he's a young kid and there's guys like Marcus Kruger on the team. And so and even Marcus said eventually he'll be a center in the National Hockey League. That was kind of the way he phrased it. So when we get into kind of the Desnoyers-Frondell debate, we give Frondell the advantage in size. He's thicker, he's bigger. We give him the advantage with the shot. He's got the one-timer. Where Scott said he lacks consistency, and his big thing with Desnoyers is hockey IQ. So that sounded like, the reason why he put Caleb ahead of Anton.
Yeah, and he was talking to how Caleb has like captain-like qualities where he's just a leader. And so I think you like that too. And yes, he was talking about the IQ that I think is, you talk about, or the Blackhawks have really prioritized speed and competitiveness. But another thing that they do prioritize heavily is the hockey sense, because they don't want guys out there that have all the skill in the world, but they can't think the game at a high level when you're playing with guys like Connor Bedard or Sam Rinzel or Artem Levshunov. Like if you can't think and you're not on the same wavelength as them, the skill really doesn't do them any good. So I think that is also a priority to go along with the speed and the competitiveness is the hockey IQ. And I think both Frondell and Desnoyers have that.
So we both have kind of said we think Frondell is the pick. Did the conversation with Scott change your mind at all? Could you see them going Desnoyers? Or could you even see a Porter Martone situation, which is a completely different player?
Yeah, I still think it's going to come down to Frondell or Desnoyers. I would give the slight edge to Frondell, but I do think because stylistically they're fairly similar. I know Frondell's got the better shot and he's thicker, like you mentioned, but just stylistically, as far as two-way potential long-term second line center, responsible in their own end, I think those are qualities that would be important for Chicago to prioritize, especially if you view Connor Bedard as your first line center. Frank Nazar, it feels like you can move him really anywhere in the lineup, left wing, right wing, center, penalty kill, power play. Like he's just a Swiss Army knife, like just that kind of gadget. But with a guy like Frondell or Desnoyers, you would be slotting them into the second line center position. I think both can get the job done. But if I had to handicap it right now, I would give the slight edge to Frondell.
All right. We're recording this the day after Florida hoists the cup for the second straight year. All I got to say is what a freaking team. That is a hockey team. And there's so many things this time of year that make me reminisce about the Blackhawks Cup winning days. There were a lot of pieces on that team that reminded me of the 2010, 13, and 15 Blackhawks.
For sure. I think this Florida team is better than last year's Florida team, and I would put this year's Florida team up against any in the salary cap era. And boy, it would be fun if you could get, the top Chicago team and the top Tampa Bay team and the top Florida team and Pittsburgh and Colorado, whoever, and you could just let them do like a little 6-game tournament or whatever. That would be so fun to watch because it's such a fun debate on social media. Throwing LA in there as well with their 2 Stanley Cups. But it's
funny you bring up a tournament because I think we'd all agree that the Four Nations was one of the bright spots for this game, if not for the game of hockey this year, right? We would all agree that it was the rating success. It got people talking about it. It was fantastic. But then you find out that 𝗵₂ 𝗵𝗀 told Darren Pang, our teammate, that he had torn a adductor off the bone and a hernia on the same side. And it's believed it happened in the Four Nations, and the timeline would lead you to believe that. And it was probably the Brandon Hagel fight. He was 50-50 whether he thought he was going to play at all. He was game time in that first series. In the second series, his dad told 𝗏𝗏𝗏 that he shouldn't be playing off the record.
Yeah.
It makes you think like, wow, the greatest moment for the sport, the Four Nations, could have had a really drastic impact on who hoisted the cup last night.
For sure. And it's actually a reason why I picked Tampa Bay to upset Florida in the first round, because I was like, I don't know what Matthew, if he's 50-50 the night before, it feels like he's just out there just to kind of be a body and a decoy. And as the playoffs continued, he just got better and better. And that dude is such a total gamer. Remember 2 years ago when he said that 𝗵𝗏 𝗍𝗏 needed, his brother Brady needed to dress him for the Stanley Cup Final games that they lost? I mean, it feels like every year he's dealing with something significant and he's finding a way to power through. And I think it's a massive reason why he has been kind of the key piece as far as the identity of that team. Like, I know Alexander Barkov is the guy, and it's been incredible to read a lot of the pieces that are coming from the writers about Barkov's importance to the culture of the team. I think Barkov is the most important to their culture, but for the identity, I think Matthew 𝗏𝗏, when his arrival came, is the one that changed it. And it was just an incredible display of hockey by the Florida Panthers. And I will say this, because I was someone that picked Edmonton in 6 games. I would have loved to seen how this series would have gone if Edmonton would have scored the first goal in a couple of these games that they didn't. It was 5 straight that they fell behind 1-0, and then 4 straight that they fell behind by at least 2 goals. And with Florida, when you're down 1-0, it feels like you're already down by 2 because they just lock it down so well. And because Florida was able to play with these leads, I think it was a record for the Stanley Cup Final that they led in ice time. Edmonton was forced to rely on Connor McDavid and Leon 𝗏𝗏 way too early. So they couldn't go with their 4-line rotation, whereas Florida was able to roll 4 lines, 3 defensemen the entire series because they always played with a lead. And I just think by the end of the series, McDavid and 𝗏𝗏 looked totally gassed. And it didn't help that obviously the 𝗏𝗏 𝗏𝗏, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins was dealing with a significant injury. Sounds like he broke a wrist, finger, whatever the case might be. And then 𝗵𝗏 𝗏𝗏 did not look like himself in the series. Probably rushed back from his injury to try to give it a go. And you admire their respect, but it just feels like Edmonton ran out of gas at the end because Florida was able to roll their normal rotations because they literally were playing every single game with a multi-goal lead.
6 straight games, they gave up 2 goals in the first period. That says all you need to know. I mean, they can blame it on a bunch of different things. They didn't have an answer. They didn't start on time. Even in game 6, I thought they had a good start the first 3 to 3.5 minutes. And then the turnover happens. And the next thing you know, it's in the back of the net. And Florida has scored on their first shot on goal. So it's, credit to Florida. What a path they took. And you talk about the culture that Matthew 𝗏𝗏 has set. There is no question about that. I love how he embraces all the pieces that have come to Florida. You look at Brad Marchand in particular, who goes from the captain of the Bruins, who wanted to stay in Boston, thought he met with management and ownership at the 12th hour to try to hammer out the final deal of his career. They say no way. He comes to a new team that has and let's be honest, Brad Marchand is a strong voice, but he sat out the remainder of the regular season, got himself ready to go right before the playoffs. And what a stellar player he was for this team. You go back to that Toronto series, they're down 2-0. He gets the overtime winner in game 3. If they're down 3-0 to Toronto, I don't think they're coming back in that series.
Right. And when Brad Marchand was acquired, he was injured. So he literally didn't get any regular season action. Like he just stepped, or did he get maybe a game or two towards the end?
Yeah.
But it's like for him to have an impact like that in the playoffs when he barely had time to get chemistry with his new teammates, playing in a different role. I mean, the way that Florida was able to roll out their lines where it was Barkov and Reinhart, Bennett and 𝗏𝗏, and then you have Marchand on the third line. I mean, that's as deep of a team as you can get in the salary cap era.
So we'll see what 𝗏𝗏, how he can work his magic. He's got 𝗏𝗏, he's got Marchand, and now he's got the Conn Smythe winner, Sam Bennett, all unrestricted free agents. You would assume all want to stay in some capacity. We'll see how they work out the money.
I feel, this is my bold prediction of the offseason. Maybe not so bold. I think Brad Marchand is going to be a Toronto Maple Leaf when it's all said and done.
I think they keep two. I think they keep Bennett for sure. And I think 𝗏𝗏 gives them and I think, and look, let's credit Seth Jones. Okay. I don't think any Blackhawk fan or even any NHL fan thought he was going to have the impact he did on the Florida Panthers, picking up a new defensive system, a man-on-man system late in the season, going to an established team that has an identity. He leaves a leadership role with the Blackhawks and he has to kind of, find his way in a new room. Man, oh man. Major props to Seth Jones. And you talked about 𝗏𝗏. How cool was that all the first timers touched the cup and hoisted the cup and made their way around the arena before any of the regulars and multiple winners touched the cup. I thought that was a class act and it was very cool.
For sure. And I'm genuinely excited that Seth Jones got this opportunity. I know his exit with Chicago probably could have been handled a little bit cleaner, but I just think the timelines were on different paths, and for him to see the immediate reward of winning a Stanley Cup, which is exactly what he wanted to go to a team that would help him do, I think is awesome. And it's part of the fan base. So is Seth Jones going to get booed when he touches the puck here in Chicago? Absolutely. And I think that's part of the fun. But I think Chicago made really well on this trade too. Like getting a guy like Spencer Knight that could be your number one goaltender of the future. It's kind of like a total bonus that you didn't have on the radar, and an additional 2026 first rounder. Like Florida might be out of gas going into next year, and that could potentially be a mid first round pick depending on how far they go. So,
and you could use some of that Seth Jones money that, he was owed and spend it on a player who's maybe a restricted free agent, who is 23, 24 years of age, and whose timeline fits the Blackhawks timeline better than Seth Jones, of course, his timeline.
100%. And so I think if you're a Blackhawks fan, you can use it as a rallying cry saying, all right, we want people that want to be here. And Nick Foligno kind of alluded to it on occasion, not really singling out Seth, but kind of saying the importance of wanting players to be part of this moving forward. So again, win-win for both sides. Hawks got what they wanted. They got the cap space. They got the money off their books so they can spend it. They also opened up a spot for Rinzel and Levshunov, which that wouldn't have happened if Seth Jones was still on this roster. And then Seth goes to Florida and wins the Stanley Cup. So I don't know what more you can ask for both sides.
And kudos to your brother who had a marriage last weekend, and they're off to their honeymoon. And as you made the point on our last podcast, it was your wedding as well. So congratulations, Charlie.
I will say I did not watch a single ounce of the game. I was a good brother. I was all in present, but I was getting fed updates, unfortunate updates, because the first one I got was 2-0. And I was like, well, that's the last update I want because I know where this is going. So yes, congratulations.
You owe me another round of golf. I was right once again.
Thank God I didn't take the double or nothing.
That's true. That's going to do it for the Blackhawks Breakaway Podcast. For CHSN, for Charlie Roumeliotis, I'm Pat Boyle. Thank you for watching and listening. We'll catch you next time.